Welcome to The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. We're joined today by Catherine Field, who covers France and Europe for New Zealand and Australian media. Nice to see you.
Hey, good evening, Francois.
Also welcoming us into their home is freelance reporter Gregory Viscusi in the French capital. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. How are you?
All right. From Brussels, AFP news editor Dave Clark. How's the week been?
Oh, it's been busy. Talks continue. Talks continue.
Talks continue. Well, we know what you're talking about. Starts with a B. Maybe we'll ask you some more about it in a short while.
We're not going to go there tonight, are we?
All right. Columnist, communications consultant, and should I say now acclaimed author, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, is with us as well. You know your graphic novel, Le Président. I managed to reserve a copy. They're out of stock at my local bookstore.
Oh, well, that's great news.
All right.
Very happy about it.
All right. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is World This Week. A fever, cough, fatigue. It's Emmanuel Macron's turn to contract COVID. The French president self-isolating at La Lanterne. That's a guest house on the grounds of the Palace of Versailles. That's an official residence for French presidents. There, Macron soldiering on with his official engagements and taking to social media.
Yesterday I tested positive, which shows that the virus can really affect anybody, because I was very well protected. I was careful. I respected all the social distancing rules. I wore a mask. I regularly used hand sanitizer. And despite everything, I caught the virus. Without doubt, it was a moment of negligence or bad luck.
Yeah, there's a little bit of controversy, I should say, Catherine, because, well, first of all, it's been very difficult to contact trace a 42-year-old workaholic head of state, as we've discovered. And Macron sure did have a full agenda, in particular, lots of scrutiny over that handshake on Monday between the president and OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria at a summit that included Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you just look back at the last week of Emmanuel Macron's calendar, it was really very heavy on in-person meetings. You think about it, Thursday and Friday of last week, he was in Brussels with all the other 27 heads of state or government of the EU. Then on Monday, he was very busy at the Rugby World Cup draw. He then went on to the OECD. Then on Tuesday, had meetings. I mean, one really does have to ask the question of, did someone drop the ball? Because there were a lot of in-person meetings, which was so much, so different from the very constrained meetings we've seen Emmanuel Macron having. And let's not forget, right at the start, he was the man who started doing the Namaste greeting when the virus first hit and when the pandemic was here in the spring. So I think someone possibly dropped the ball and allowed too many in-person meetings there.
And again, that handshake that we saw on Monday. Now, the French health minister, himself a doctor, insists Macron's always careful and quick to point the finger at that summit in Brussels.
Nej, men det är väl helt enkelt att vi har jag anser vi har misslyckats. Vi ändå.
All right, that was not Olivier Véran. Olivier Véran, the French health minister, who said he squarely blamed the summit. Let's take a listen.
Le chef de l'État, en l'occurrence, n'a pas été manifestement contaminé au cours d'un déjeuner ou d'un dîner à l'Élysée, mais vraisemblablement, d'après ce qu'on entend, en tout cas possiblement lors d'un Conseil européen il y a quelques jours, 4 ou 5 jours à Bruxelles, avec des chefs d'État, un dîner de travail, je crois, qui avait été organisé dans une grande pièce espacée. Malheureusement, on n'est pas à l'abri d'une contamination.
All right, let's put this to epidemiologist Dave Clark. Dave, by the way, Véran is a neurologist. He's not a virologist. Now we've learned that the Slovakian Prime Minister has tested positive. Is that proof?
Well, it's a correlation. I don't know if it's a causation. There were a lot of questions here in Brussels this week about exactly when Emmanuel Macron first got infected, because it makes a lot of difference across the continent. I was going to say that 27 European leaders were in that room with him on that day, but in fact it was only 26 because Jüri Ratas of Estonia did not make it because he was already self-isolating. And as you say, Ivan Matovic of Slovakia has since tested positive, and he was in that room with Macron. Now, we don't know whether they had any close contact. Obviously, it's a large conference room to have that many heads of state in it. But they did meet beforehand. That was all seen on camera. People were bumping elbows and laughing and joking. It wasn't just the 27 as well. There were European officials there. Now, Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, has taken a test, says he's negative, but is isolating anyway per the guidelines. But Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, says she doesn't feel she has to take a test. And both of those people did meet Macron in Paris this week, on Sunday and Monday, because they were there along with Pedro Sanchez at the OECD meeting.
Yeah, and Portugal's prime minister had to cancel a 3-day tour of Africa.
Yes, there's a lot of concern in Brussels, obviously, because the whole continent's leadership could be affected by this eventually, at least in terms of self-isolation. Or hopefully there won't be too many more cases, although obviously that's already quite a high percentage with just 2. Now, there have been quite a few summits this year that have been conducted virtually because of the COVID crisis, but the leaders felt that they couldn't get their most important agenda items decided doing the summits virtually, because people won't speak frankly when they're on video, as we are now. We don't know how many millions of people are watching France 24 right now, and some of them may be screen grabbing what I'm saying. If this was a private summit, it might not stay private for long.
All right, the night before falling ill, French president hosts a working dinner for 9 leaders of his coalition, including the prime minister and the speaker of the National Assembly, to prepare for upcoming regional elections. Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, will that do lasting damage, that dinner?
Yes, this part of the episode will have lasting damage, because it's like, you know, we forbid you to go to a restaurant, we forbid you to be more than 6 at your Christmas table, but I, president, can do it, and I can do it whenever I want, with how many people I want, as much people as I want, and we don't really we care because we've been like caught in the action, and I'm sick because of that, but. You know, it's business as usual for me. And that's not something that French people can really accept, because in France, we are really keen on being equals. And this kind of thing is not really good for his popularity. But the social media part he did today was quite good on the other hand. And he kind of admitted that he had a bad behavior, which is kind of new. He doesn't recognize his own faults most of the time, but this time, yes. So maybe it's the beginning of wisdom raising inside the minds of our political class. And maybe they start to understand that, yes, you can be contaminated if you have dinner or lunch in a enclosed space. And even if you are at 3 meters of your most immediate neighbor, it's like non-important, because you are in the closed space. And if you are in a closed space, you will get contaminated anyway. So maybe they will start to understand that. It's time, after 9 months into this contagion business, it's time that they understand that point. Okay, so there'll be a positive effect in that this will serve as a cautionary tale for everyone, Gregory Viscusi, that it's not great when you have a family gathering of lots of people. Just a reminder of the rules. It's the government wants it to be 6 adults maximum on Christmas Eve, because in France it's Christmas Eve, the big night when you have the dinner. Do you agree with Philippe that this could maybe do lasting damage to Macron?
I think it will definitely do lasting damage, even though it probably is not at that dinner that he was infected. If you just look at the timeline, it's unlikely. It's too short a time. And we should point out that a table that they sit at the Élysée is probably the size of most Paris apartment buildings. But still, I think the timing is terrible from a PR point of view for Macron, coming right before Christmas, right before the biggest family gathering of the year in France, when people are being told to limit to 6. And we find out that a dinner that was not on his schedule. So I mean, we wouldn't even have known about this dinner if he hadn't gotten sick. It wasn't not on his official schedule. Probably wouldn't have known about it if he hadn't gotten sick. You know, he goes ahead and has 10 people at his table. So no, I think that it's terrible. It's a terrible optic for him.
Yeah, and by the way, that dinner throwing the spotlight on what goes on in the high halls of power after hours. There was this tweet, "Were the women in the kitchen?" It was put out by left-wing Euro MP Aurore Laluc. Catherine Field, your reaction to that, the fact that here you have these, 10 people around the table, not a single woman.
Yeah, all white men.
Yeah, well, the photo speaks for itself, doesn't it? And when you look at other comparable nations in Europe, you know, who have not only got heads of political parties, but also the heads of government, heads of state, females. Yeah, I mean, that particular tweet, that photo really did show up just how much ground French female politicians have got to make up.
Do you see a change coming, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, between now and the campaign for the next presidential elections?
Oh, there will be many, many changes. For instance, if this vaccination campaign doesn't work as it should, I think the backlash will be absolutely devastating for anyone who will be there in charge. And there's a good chance that we don't really handle that well. And I think we will have a big surprise in the next election, presidential election. It's unlikely that we know everything yet. There will be a lot of shocks, and we expect 1 million unemployed more, and we expect a lot of troubles. And really, the vaccination business, it's really the most important thing. If we are able to be efficient, quick, and to the point with this campaign, then maybe we will be out of this quite quickly, and we'll be campaigning for 1 year in a kind of more calm, more relaxed mode. But if it goes bad, the hell will happen. I don't know what will happen.
All right, right now it is a winter of discontent. The latest country to return to lockdown is Austria, a third time round. One Scandinavian nation had up to now been an outlier throughout the pandemic, never going into full lockdown despite a much higher death toll than its neighbors. We're talking about Sweden. So, did the king overstep his ceremonial prerogatives when interviewed for an end-of-year special by state television? Let's listen.
Nej, men det är väl helt enkelt att vi har jag anser vi har misslyckats. Vi är ändå det är stort antal som har avlidit helt enkelt, och det är ju fruktansvärt. Det är någonting som vi alla lider med, tror jag. Att vi inte har kunnat hjälpa dem, och det är ju en ganska, ska inte säga, men det är tråkigt. Det är helt enkelt bara fruktansvärt tråkigt.
We have failed. It's terribly sad. Your reaction, Dave Clark?
Well, it is unusual for a constitutional monarch to intervene in public health policy, but I've got to assume that he has a back channel if he wants to communicate with the Prime Minister, and that if he's chosen to do it this way, it might just be that he's not getting through. The figures in Sweden are terrifying. And I say that as someone sitting in Belgium, which has the most deaths per capita of any country in the world. We're so used over the many years of my career covering politics around the world to seeing the figures from Scandinavian countries putting everyone to shame when it comes to public health, public education, the way they've managed to balance the social welfare states with the capitalist economies. They usually come at the top of all of the UN's league tables for things, and Sweden really does seem to have just missed the point of on COVID. Maybe it was time for the king to intervene.
Maybe it was time for the king to intervene, Gregory Viscusi?
Yeah, probably. I mean, he has I think when your subjects are dying, I think you have a right to speak, whether it's a constitutional monarchy or not. I'd be a little careful about judging countries too soon. I mean, we're probably halfway through this whole affair, maybe a little bit more than halfway through. And at different moments, you could look at different countries, and they look good on the graphs, they look bad on the graphs compared to their neighbors. Every country's been on very different curves. Now, it's true. Sweden, definitely right now, the numbers are absolutely terrifying. But they were better than some of the larger European countries earlier. I'm not sure whether you should be comparing Sweden to France and Germany, where they're pretty much on par, or whether you should be comparing them to their neighbors like Finland or Norway. I mean, you could argue both ways. It's a much more open economy. It's a much more connected country than Norway and Finland are. So, I mean, they are going to be, you know, they do have more contacts with the outside world. So I'm not sure that's necessarily the best comparison.
You mentioned Germany. Last week we talked about Germany being forced into a pre-Christmas lockdown. Now it's Britain that's had to scrap that time immemorial holiday tradition, the Christmas pantomime for the kids. In Chelmsford, northeast of London, they found a solution, the drive-in panto. All right, those are not the images of the drive-in panto in Chelmsford, but just let me ask you before we go to the break, Catherine Field, canceling pantos, it really is a dark Christmas.
Well, I don't want to sound a little mean, but I think there's enough pantomime going on in the House of Commons at the moment and in Downing Street. I think the great British public is seeing enough pantomime from Prime Minister's questions and various other debates that we're having around the famous Brexit to keep everyone going and to keep everyone on their seats.
Dave Clark, just explain for people who don't know pantos just how big a deal this is.
It's an annual theatrical tradition, very broad, childish humour, very colourful. It's a bit like Brussels sprouts. It's not necessarily very much fun, but because you always do it at Christmas, it forms part of the experience. I know that, you know, my son has been growing up on the continent, but last year when we were back, we made sure we took him to a panto to keep in touch with his British roots. And this, when people have to miss out on things like this, then that will remind them why they need better leadership.
All right, and we'll be talking in part 2 about leadership going forward on this pandemic. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. We're in the company of Catherine Field, who covers France and Europe for New Zealand and Australian media. Gregory Viscusi, freelance reporter, is also with us from Paris. From Brussels, AFP news editor Dave Clark and columnist, communications consultant Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet. Your graphic novel is out, Le Président. Welcome back to the show. It's 33 days till the next occupant of the White House is sworn in. And while the COVID numbers are grim, there are reasons to hope. The outgoing vice president, who heads the country's COVID task force, getting his jab in front of the cameras this Friday to encourage others. Congress is actually working on a desperately needed compromise coronavirus stimulus plan. Oh, and the most powerful man on Capitol Hill recognized the results of the November 3rd election.
So today I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden. The President-elect is no stranger to the Senate. He's devoted himself to public service for many years. I also want to congratulate the Vice President-elect, our colleague from California, Senator Harris. Beyond our differences, all Americans can take pride that our nation has a female Vice President-elect for the very first time.
So, Gregory Viscusi, soon we'll be well under heaven and earth?
I'm not sure what was more important, Mitch McConnell recognizing Biden's win or Vladimir Putin recognizing Biden's win. It was only a few hours apart in both cases. I mean, it's a done deal at this point. Yes, there's a few Republican congressmen who can cause some trouble when they meet January 6th to ratify the results in Congress, but there's nothing they can do to stop it. The question is, what's the lasting damage from all this? Was it just sort of one last blast from Trump, and the Republicans just humored him by letting him get away with all these shenanigans just so that he wouldn't get too angry at them? Or is this the template to come? Does this mean that any time a Republican loses any election at any level anywhere in the country, they're going to claim it was stolen from them? And will Republican voters spend the next 4 years convinced that the election was stolen from them? There could be some really, really serious repercussions for American democracy from this.
And maybe not just American democracy. Donald Trump peddling bombast and outrage. Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, that graphic novel we were talking about, you wrote, Le Président. Yeah, of course, if we're talking about Donald Trump writing the playbook, Donald Trump lost his re-election bid. Nonetheless, will he inspire others on this side of the Atlantic going forward?
Yes, he could, because it was unexpected that a clown and a popular figure such as Donald Trump would be elected with the support of the Republican Party. And that's amazing that he managed to do that. And of course, he lost, but he kind of attracts attention still all the time. And is like an attention magnet, and we didn't find a cure against that yet. I mean, Biden won, and that's a huge relief for anyone, but it's on this side of the Atlantic. But it's not obvious that he couldn't be reelected again. And the way he managed to, create and gather a huge basis of really huge fans of him, and that would support him until the end, including by rioting, demonstrating in the streets, and the way kind of managed his PR, and he was the center of the media circus for 4 years. And that's quite an achievement for someone who has no political culture and doesn't have a clue about any issue or big issue that he is supposed to be running. He spends most of his time, golfing or not paying attention. And he was basically like an old man watching TV and commentating it on Twitter, but except that he had all the nuclear power and the authority of the president.
Dave Clark, you covered Washington for AFP. You go to Brussels. Is there a Trump effect that has perhaps followed you to Brussels, and will it continue to linger once he's out of office?
Well, I gave up covering the Trump administration to come and cover Brexit, and there's certainly some parallels between those two topics. But for the institutions in Brussels, there is a division now between those who think everything will go back to the way it was before, that Biden will be continuity Obama, and that we don't need to worry about the transatlantic relationship. We can just rebuild it as it was before. And others who think that, a Trump happened once, a Trump could happen again, and that maybe Europe should build its own geostrategic independence, that Europe now should know that sometimes it will have to protect itself, that it will have to, if it wants to project power as a global power, they will have to learn to do so without necessarily the Americans holding their hands. This is a thing that honestly some people began thinking about even before Trump. Obviously, Obama was a Pacific president, he liked to say, and as time goes on, the special relationship, if you will, between Europe and the United States, in the absence of a Cold War, will evolve, and maybe it is time, as especially Emmanuel Macron would say, for Europe to develop its own strategic footprint, regardless of who's in the White House. Trump was a warning. But then there are others, perhaps in Berlin more, who think that's okay now. Trump was a bad dream. He's going, and Biden will restore things as before. We'll see how it goes.
All right, and there could be transatlantic cooperation in one area, and it's perhaps a little unexpected. There's a pendulum swing against the unbridled power of Silicon Valley. This week, the European Commission unveiled its double-barreled blueprint for regulating free speech and competition on the net. It includes the nuclear option, the eventual breakup of digital behemoths. No names given on Tuesday, but thoughts did turn to Facebook, owner of Instagram and WhatsApp, especially after last week's antitrust lawsuits in the U.S. against that social media giant. On Thursday, though, it was a group of 9 U.S. attorney generals, Republicans and Democrats, reminding us that there's not just Facebook, there's also Google.
Google's conduct is aimed at monopolizing the emerging ways consumers access general search engines, including through smart speakers, TV sets, or even in their cars.
Your thoughts on this, Catherine Field?
Yeah, times are going to start getting a bit tough for Google, I think. You've got, on the one hand, you've got Europe recognizing that Google has just got almost a monopoly on information. Plus, you see that they're not paying much tax in Europe. And the other problem, of course, is that unlike with Brexit, where the Europeans have really stuck together, when it comes to Google, they're pretty much divided. You cannot get Ireland and Luxembourg to be on the same page, say, as the French. So it's a problem. I think one of the interesting things that's come out of this is we've seen what in the last 6 months, Francois, the number of lobbyists that Google has in Brussels beating on the door of all these, of the members of the European Parliament and members of the Commission. We're finally now getting to see just how enormous, and you could almost say out of control, Google has become here in Europe.
Gregory Viscusi, is it a turning point?
It probably is, just because you've got action on both sides of the Atlantic. But I'm going to play a little bit of the devil's advocate here. I mean, okay, the case against Google is a bit firmer because Google does. I mean, most people do their searches through Google. It's sort of the gateway to all sorts of economic activity. And Google does seem to favor its own applications over other forms of searching on its search thing. So there is something against Google, but Facebook, you're not obliged to go on Facebook. There are others. I mean, for all this talk of how powerful they are, I mean, TikTok is successful, Snapchat's successful. You can just use email. I mean, not everyone's forced to go on Facebook. And as that question about tax that Catherine raised, I mean, yeah, these companies don't pay enough tax in the countries they operate in, but they didn't write the tax code. That's because the EU has this crazy tax system where they allow tax competition between their members, and big companies just play the games, but they're not breaking any rules. It's the EU that wrote those tax rules. So I don't know. I think there's a little bit of self-righteousness involved here, but I'm not saying these companies in any way are blameless. I'm just playing a bit of a devil's advocate here because there's so much outrage all over the place.
You hear that, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet? You're not obliged to use Facebook.
No, that's true, but also, there is no strict obligation. I mean, when you want to look for something on the internet, of course, you have to go through Google. If you want to have an email on your smartphone, most of the time, if you don't have an iPhone, you will be going through Google. So it's like a private monopoly.
I said the case against Google is stronger than the case against Facebook.
Yeah, sure. But the fact is, Google is so strong now that it can invest like 30 billions in research and development in every sectors, such as health, for instance. Most states can compete against that, and they can't afford to spend that much money into research, for instance. So it's like, okay, we have to fight against these big monopolies, but we helped creating them, and now they are stronger than ever, and the fight is unequal. And if we go against them, what is the alternative? What other model do we have? Can we dismantle these groups and make autonomous companies from these groups? Won't it destroy value more than it would create value for the society at large? It's a bit late to go against the GAFAs. It should be done from my point of view, but I'm French. That's why I think they should be taxed. And I think we should fight against tax havens, and they should be paying taxes a lot because they are big. But apart from that, I don't know. Maybe it's too late for controlling them.
All right, it's not too late for those 344 schoolboys who've been reunited with their families in Nigeria, free after their abduction a week ago, greeted by the state governor of Katsina in the northwest. It's unclear, though, how many more are still being held. Katsina, outside of where Boko Haram usually operates, and that's what angers activists. They're fed up with radicals. They're also fed up with bandits, And Dave Clark, one question on everyone's lips. It was splashed across the front page of the daily newspaper Punch. The government denying paying a ransom. Your thoughts?
When I used to live in Nigeria, the government and the oil companies would always deny paying ransoms, but sometimes kidnappees would be released and sometimes they wouldn't. And there's always an assumption that a ransom was paid. In this case, you're right, Boko Haram doesn't usually operate so much in Katsina. It's historically been more in the northeast of the country, around Maiduguri and Borno State. But there are 3 large crime families operating in Katsina who are alleged now to have cooperated with Boko Haram, to almost have kidnapped these boys to order. And it's perhaps any bribes that were paid were not paid to the Islamist group, but to the bandits. Maybe somebody outbid Boko Haram to get these kids back.
Katsina, by the way, the home state, just to remind our viewers, of Nigeria's president. Let's listen to Muhammadu Buhari, who, in an interview, called on security forces to do more, all the while defending his record.
Well, we are doing our best. Remember when we closed the borders? We found out that still, somehow, the terrorists or the abductors still get weapons and ammunition. They still take people hostages. They are collecting millions of naira. We have a lot of work ahead of us.
So, Dave Clark, I'm hearing 2 kinds of reactions to the freeing of these schoolboys. Some saying it's, at least this time, authorities acted quicker than, of course, with the Chibok girls 6 years ago. The whole world remembers that in the Northeast. On the other hand, saying what's going on? Why is insecurity such a problem in a country where people are already angry over police abuse?
Well, I mean, that's exactly it. The contract between the people and the security forces has always been a very weak one in Nigeria. Obviously, it has a history of authoritarian military rule, including Muhammadu Buhari when he was formerly a general and a dictator before he came back in much later life. Obviously, he's a very elderly man now. When he talks about closing down the borders, in Nigerian terms, with all due respect to the president, that's a bit of a nonsense to talk about that. Nigeria is a country of almost 200 million people now. If you add together the populations of all the bordering countries together, they're a suburb of Lagos. And the idea that there wouldn't be terrorism in Nigeria if there wasn't arms being smuggled in from outside. Now, ideas may be coming in from outside, but the personnel here are disaffected Nigerians, and Nigeria has been awash with weapons for years. There is a problem around the country between a lack of trust between the police, which is essentially an entrepreneurial organization dedicated to collecting tolls at checkpoints, and obviously there's a certain amount of suspicion of the army, whose attitude to uprisings has always been extremely brutal. I've travelled in the area around the borders in Borno State many years ago, but there was already a Islamic insurrection when I was there. And state actors in that part of the world do have to travel in long convoys with a lot of security. There isn't really a contract between the people of that area and the federal government of Nigeria.
All right, a breakdown of trust on the one hand, but Catherine Field on the other. And we saw with that End SARS movement that happened earlier this year in Nigeria. They say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now you can no longer hide the corruption like you could before.
Yeah, you can't. It's really far more in the open now. I think for me, the big question is, you've got all of the ingredients to have the sort of, dare one say, dysfunctional state, like we're seeing some others in the Sahel. You're seeing banditry, you're seeing terrorist groups, you're seeing whole swathes of the country that the central government has no control over. So it is these bandits that do their deals with various actors, and it is getting out of control. We're seeing it not just in the northeast, now the northwest, and it's seeping into the central regions. So, for me, will Nigeria become part of this? The concern, the unrest, the instability of the Sahel. Will the Sahel stretch right across the Sahara to Lake Chad? And really, those are the sort of questions we've got to be asking now as to, is this where it's going and how can it be stopped?
Front page story in French broadsheet Le Monde, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, is about the French, how they want to hand over some of the responsibility for policing those parts of Francophone West Africa where they're taking on jihadists, but nobody else in Europe picking up the mantle much. There are exceptions, though. This is a story that, again, is reminding public opinion that what's going on over there can have an impact here as well.
Yes, for sure. And we've been living with that for years. And it's very important for the French president. The most important part of the presidency of the former president, François Hollande, was his action in Africa, as he told the press. Maybe it was not a good thing to say, but I think he was really thinking that the African policy was the most important thing that he achieved. And most French people don't realize that we are deeply involved in Africa, and that we have, I think, at least 2 wars that we are fighting at the same time. And of course, part of the problems we have in France regarding terrorism is linked to these actions that we have. But not many people do have an interest in discussing that for the moment. It's like terrorism would only be a French problem on the French soil, but no connection whatsoever with our foreign policy. And most of the time, we don't discuss foreign policy anymore. We are very centered on the domestic issues, which is understandable regarding what is currently happening. I mean, we have crisis on crisis and on top of crisis on top of crisis. So French people, they are very self-involved for the moment. You have to forgive them for that. Forgive us.
Before we go, he rubbed the veneer off of the James Bond glamour of the British spy and kept you in suspense with his Cold War page-turners. John le Carré, dying at his home in Cornwall at the age of 89. The best-selling novelist learned German in school, worked for both domestic and foreign intelligence. When he turned to writing, Le Carré shined the spotlight on British services reeling from the betrayal of Kim Philby, who had fled to Moscow in 1963. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, he understood that the world would become, well, a harder place to understand.
Alec Lemus, the star of Spy Who Came In From the Cold, curses the system that he's serving, but serves it to the end. And the reason for that was we had an identifiable enemy ideologically, and that was communism. Today, we have really no identifiable enemy except among ourselves. And the search for ideology is becoming very peculiar and very alarming.
Yeah, this problem of the identifiable enemy, Catherine Field, when even we were just talking about Nigeria, it's so hard to pinpoint who done it.
Well, John le Carré is, of course, one of those great British writers. He stands alongside Graham Greene, Len Deighton as the master of the crime thriller, the spy thriller. I feel a bit sorry for John le Carré in a way, because some of his early work, particularly in the 1970s, I'm thinking of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the centre of that was Britain in decline, Britain having been left behind by the rest of the world, or allowed itself to be left behind. And in his later years, he was very vocal when it came to Brexit. He was a firm Remainer. So you see this arc of how his life, literature became part of his life, and which is very sad. But he was an extraordinary writer. I mean, any of his books, I mean, he didn't glorify, didn't glamorize spies at all. He made it pretty clear that they live in grey zones, they act in grey zones, and that there will always be innocent people who get caught up and who will die at the same time. But it's very sad that he's died, and it's even more unfortunate that he spent his last years talking about Britain in decline again and Brexit going. And one of the interesting things, one of his last novels, which George Smiley appeared, was The Secret Pilgrim. And it was in that novel that George Smiley said, "I did it for Europe." And in no other of his books had John le Carré mentioned his love for Europe. So he went back to it at the end, and it's sad because he's got such great novels, and they really were page-turners.
You hear that, Dave Clark? You thought you would get away from talking about Brexit for an hour.
Yes, no, my phone has been buzzing in my pocket. I hope there's no Brexit news out there in Brussels right now. I read John le Carré's Legacy of Spies there, the 2017 book, where he came back on some of the themes of the earlier one. And as Catherine mentioned, it seems that since the obvious Cold War enemy, there's the Soviets and Carre, the Soviet spy chief, or the fictional one in the Smiley novels, has gone. He seems that he's picked up other enemies. Transatlantic enemies. He became fairly anti-American as much as he became pro-European in his later books, and I think that probably reflects a certain strain of thought in some elite British circles.
Right, and again, that line in one of the final novel of his Carla trilogy, where he says it's grey, half angels fighting half devils. No one knows where the lines are. Dave Clark, many thanks for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Catherine Field, Gregory Viscusi, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet here in Paris, and thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.